Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another of the Peninsula Seniors Lecture Programs. We're really very fortunate this morning because I have the distinct honor and high privilege of welcoming the 33rd President of the United States, President Harry S. Truman.
I had a choice early in life, to be a piano player in a whorehouse or a politician. And to tell you the truth, there's not a difference between either one. Now, I'm known for plain speaking, and one time when I was campaigning in the Farm Belt, I said, the reason the farmers have such fertile fields is because of the manure they spread all over it. Well, I continued talking about manure, and a reporter became very uncomfortable by my continuous use of that word. And he went up to my wife, Bess, and he asked her, Mrs. Truman, can't you get the president to use a better word like fertilizer? She said it took her 25 years to get me to use the word manure. One day at the Truman Library, a young boy came up to me. I don't think he could have been more than 12 years old, and he asked me, Mr. President, were you ever popular when you were a boy? And I said, oh, no, not at all. You see, the very popular fellows were those who were really good at sports. And the problem is, ever since I was a young boy, I had to wear these thick eyeglasses because of my poor eyesight. So I couldn't play a lot of sports and rough games with the other fellas. But I did a lot of reading, and I think I must have read every book there was in the Independence Library by the time I graduated high school. And the books that I enjoyed reading the most were biographies and history. And I found that reading history was very important when I entered public life and politics, because what I learned was there is nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. But getting back to my childhood, as I said, the really popular boys were those who were really good at sports. Well, there was one girl who was quite popular with all the other fellas because she had a good, strong pitching arm. Her name was Bess Wallace. Well, Bess and I met in our Sunday school class when she was 5 and I was 6. And 29 years later, I asked her to marry me, and she did. And we've been married since 1919, and we live over in her family's home over on Delaware Street, just a few blocks from the Truman Library. And we are also the very proud parents of a daughter, Margaret. And like any parent, I'm very proud of what my daughter has accomplished. You know, she's a best-selling author, a radio and television interviewer, and when I was president, she began a career as a concert singer. And, of course, I proudly followed the progress of her singing career. Well, one evening in December of 1950, she held a concert at the Daughters of the American Revolution's Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C. The following day, there was a review of it in the Washington Post by their critic, Paul Hume. It was the most goddamned awful review I ever read. In it, he said, while Miss Truman had a pleasant personality, her voice was flat and she couldn't sing. Well, I wrote to him and I told him what I thought of his goddamn lousy, awful review. I told him he must be the most frustrated man on earth. He's probably got all 4 ulcers working on all 8 of them. And I told him, and I wrote to him, that I thought that Westbrook Pelger, the columnist, who I thought was a gutter snipe, was a gentleman compared to him. And that if I ever met him, he better have a beefsteak for an eye and a supporter below. Well, when this letter was leaked to the public, many people were shocked and outraged that the President of the United States would use that kind of language. But I wasn't writing as the President of the United States. I was writing as an outraged father. And as it turned out, we got many letters back on it at the White House. I found out there are a lot more outraged parents out there than there are outraged politicians. Now, when I was born in 1884, my parents, Martha Young and John Anderson Truman, decided to name me Harry after my Uncle Harrison. But they couldn't decide on a middle name. My mother wanted to name me Harry Solomon Truman after her father, Solomon Young. And my father wanted to name me Harry Ship Truman after his father, Anderson Ship Truman. Well, they couldn't decide on either Ship or Solomon, so it became S, and it's been Harry S. Truman ever since then. Now, my parents grew up during the time of the American Civil War, or as their families called it, the War Between the States. Those of you who know your history know that Missouri was a border state during that war, and my parents and their families were actually supporters of the Confederacy. Why, my mother's own home was actually occupied by federal troops, and she and her family were forced into what were called posts, which were nothing more than detention or prison camps. Well, I think you can imagine that that war left a very bitter legacy with my family. Many in my family thought it was a good thing that Abraham Lincoln was shot. But I don't think so, because I think Lincoln was probably our greatest president, because I believe he had the guts to do what had to be done in order to save our nation. If he didn't, why, we would have broken up into little countries like they've got down there in Latin America, and we would have lost our government and liberty and way of life, and, well, I wouldn't have been able to grow up to become president of the United States. But it takes a long time for a lot of those old hatreds to die. I remember in 1902, I was 18 years old, and I had joined the Missouri National Guard. And I proudly wore my blue uniform into my grandfather's home. His response was, "Harry, there hasn't been a blue uniform in this house in 40 years. Don't ever wear that in here again." And I never did wear it in my grandfather's home. Why, in 1945, the year I succeeded to the presidency, 80 years after that war ended, I invited my then 92-year-old mother to the White House. And when she arrived, I said to her, "Mama, I want you to have the honor of sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom." She said she'd rather sleep on the floor than to sleep in that man's bed. But as president, I had to face one of the bitter legacies of that war, and that, unfortunately, was discrimination and prejudice against and bias against many of our fellow citizens because of their race, their color, their religion, or their nationality. And as president, I tried to do something to remedy that. In early 1948, I sent a civil rights message to the Congress calling for laws to end segregation, discrimination, to end the poll tax, to stop lynching. We set up a Federal Employment Fair Practice Commission to end discrimination in federal hiring. And that summer, I signed an executive order ending racial segregation in the armed forces of the United States. That same summer, at the Democratic National Convention, which we held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, we adopted a strong civil rights plank over the objection of many of the Southern delegates. Some of them actually walked out of that election, and many more actually opposed me in that election. One of them happened to be the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. Well, when reporters asked him, they said, "But Governor Thurmond, didn't President Franklin Roosevelt say the same thing about civil rights?" He said, "Yes, but Truman means it." After I graduated high school, I wanted to attend either the military academy at West Point or the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Now, unfortunately, I was rejected because of my poor eyesight, and my family didn't have the money to send me to college. So I went to work as a bank clerk for several years in Kansas City, and then I was asked to help run the family farm in Grandview, just south of Kansas City, which I did for 10 years. And then in 1917, when we entered World War I, my National Guard unit was mobilized, and I went into service. I was promoted through the ranks, eventually reaching the rank of captain. And I was shipped over to France to participate in the fighting. Well, when I arrived there, they assigned me to the most ornery and disruptive unit there ever was in the United States Army. It was a unit of these rowdy Irish Catholic fellows from Kansas City. They were an artillery unit called Battery D. And they had already gone through several commanders, and they figured they were going to go through me and get rid of me just as easily. So on the day I took command, I stood them all at attention. I looked them over, and I told them, "I'm not here to get along with you. You're here to get along with me." Dismissed? Well, they soon learned what old Captain Harry was made out of. I remember it was during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and we came under the most heavy German artillery barrage that you could imagine. and a lot of those fellas got so damn scared they started running. Well, I started calling them every single name that I could think of, most of which I can't repeat in front of you dear ladies. But when they saw that old Captain Harry wasn't going to run, they decided to hold the line, and we made it through the battle. And I'll tell you, we made it through that battle, and they learned to respect me. Oh, I could be tough on them when they got out of line, but they also found if they ever had a problem, they could always bring it to old Captain Harry. Well, it was during my military service I was to make two very important friendships that were to affect my future careers. First was with a gentleman by the name of Eddie Jacobson. Now, before I had been shipped over to France, Eddie and I had run the company canteen at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and we ran it at a profit. And we decided if we made it through the war that we'd put our resources together and go into business, and that's exactly what we did. And we opened up a haberdashery, a men's clothing shop in Kansas City in 1919. And for about a year or so, we did quite well and actually made a profit. But in that Republican recession in the early 1920s, we lost everything. And eventually we had to close the business. Eddie became a buyer for men's clothing companies, and of course I entered politics. Well, despite that, we still maintained our friendship over the years. And despite all the public offices that I was to hold, Eddie never took advantage of that. But one day in March of 1948, he came to the White House to speak to me about an issue that was of deep personal concern to him. It was the issue of Palestine, or what would later become the State of Israel. And he was very concerned whether or not a Jewish state would be created there. Now, several months earlier, we had supported the United Nations partition plan to divide Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. But it appeared that once the British left in mid-May of 1948, war would break out and the Jews wouldn't even have their own state. But Eddie made the case for the Jewish state. So as a result, I had a private meeting at the White House with Dr. Chaim Weizmann. He was the leader of the Zionist movement, and I invited him down to a private meeting at the White House. And I assured Dr. Weizmann at our meeting that I would support any state that the Jews would establish in Palestine. Well, in the afternoon of Friday, May 14, 1948, I had received word that the State of Israel had been declared in Tel Aviv. And I saw to it immediately the United States of America was the first nation in the world to recognize the State of Israel and to welcome it into the family of nations. I believe that was the right thing to do. You know, when I think of the persecutions that the Jewish people have endured and suffered throughout their history, and especially the genocide that they suffered at the hands of the Nazis, I believed as the leader of the free world, this was the right thing to do. Later, when I had another meeting with Dr. Weizmann, who had now been elected the president of the State of Israel, I said to him, Dr. Weizmann, I don't think you have any idea what it's like being president of a nation of 150 million people. He said, I had no idea what it was like being president of a nation with 1 million presidents. The other important friendship I made during that war was with an officer in my unit. He was a lieutenant by the name of Jim Pendergast. His uncle was Tom Pendergast, the political boss in Kansas City and basically the leader of the Democratic Party in that part of Missouri. Well, after I lost my business, I decided to run for public office, and I sought and got the support of the Pendergast organization in the first of several elections as county judge, which, of course, in Missouri, a county judge is like a county supervisor or a county commissioner. Well, at the time that I was running in the 1920s, there was a lot of local activity by a very prominent national organization. And I'm very sorry to tell you I made the damn stupid mistake of sending in a membership application to them. It was the Ku Klux Klan. Well, the truth is, I really didn't have much in common with those fellas, and they couldn't understand why a good Baptist like me would have a friend and a business partner who was a Jew like Eddie Jacobson, or why I'd be supported by wet Irish Catholics like the Pendergasts. Well, one day my friend Eddie Jacobson put me at ease, and he said, Harry, don't worry. I'm sure the organizer of the Klan is a Jew. How do you know, Eddie? Harry, who else is going to sell $1.95 sheets to some silly goyim at a profit of $17.95? In 1934, with the support of the Pendergast organization, I was elected to the first of 2 terms to the United States Senate. Now, I campaigned as a very strong supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal policies. I believe what President Roosevelt was doing was the right thing to get our nation on the road to recovery. Well, I remember when I arrived in Washington, D.C. in early 1935 to take my oath of office as a United States Senator. And I remember when I entered the Senate chamber, and I was just awed by the whole experience. I mean, here I was going to sit in the same great chamber that had seen such great statesmen like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Robert La Follette, William Borah, and many other great men. And now here I was to take my place among them. Well, one day one of the veteran senators came up to me and he said, "Harry, don't worry. The first 6 months you're here, you're going to wonder how you got here, and then you're going to wonder how the rest of us got here." Well, I began to understand what he meant. It's a tradition for freshman senators to be seen and not heard, and to take a turn presiding over a session of the United States Senate. Well, one day it was my turn to preside over the Senate, and who got up to speak that day? But none other than that damn demagogue from Louisiana, Huey Long. Well, the Kingfish, as he called himself, had his own plan to end the Depression. He called it Share Our Wealth. But he was just using the occasion to criticize and damn everything that Franklin Roosevelt was doing to get our nation on the road to recovery. Well, when the Kingfish got up to speak, the other members of the Senate decided to boycott him, and they walked out on him. As the presiding officer of the Senate, I stayed there to listen to him carrying on all day. When he was finished and the Senate was adjourned, he came up to me and he said, "Harry, I want to thank you for staying there and listening to me." All I could tell him was, "I had to, Huey." And we never spoke to each other after that. By 1941, war had already been waging in Europe for 2 years. 4 years earlier, Japan had attacked China, and it looked like we might be getting into this thing. So I became a strong supporter of President Roosevelt's defense preparedness policies. I wanted our nation to be ready in case war came. Well, I was still an active member of the Missouri National Guard. I was actually a colonel in the United States Army Reserves, and I wanted to do my part to help my nation at such a critical time. So in the summer of 1941, I went over to the War Department to speak to the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, General George Marshall. And I told him, "General, I want to get into this thing." Well, he looked up at me and he said, "Well, I'd like to help you, Senator, but you're too old." "General, I'm 4 years younger than you are." "Yes, but I'm in already." Well, 4 years later, when I had my first meeting with General Marshall as President of the United States, I asked him, "Well, General, who's in now?" But I want to say this about George Marshall. I believe he is probably one of the greatest living Americans there ever was. As the Chief of Staff of the United States Army in World War II, he was our true architect of victory. And when victory was finally achieved in 1945, he finally retired after 45 years of dedicated service to his nation. Unfortunately, we were having problems over in China. Our ambassador, Patrick Hurley, had suddenly resigned, and a civil war was breaking out between the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek and communist rebels led by Mao Zedong. So I asked General Marshall to come out of retirement to become our ambassador to China, which he did without a moment's hesitation. And he spent nearly a year there trying to negotiate a ceasefire in that civil war. And then in 1947, I nominated him to become Secretary of State of the United States. And it was during his tenure as Secretary of State he was to rise to the highest ranks of world statesmen. Well, this was the situation that year. Europe totally lay in ruin as a result of the Second World War. Stalin was grabbing up the eastern half of Europe. Britain was bankrupt. And it appeared that both Italy and France could go communist without even a single shot being fired. Only we in the United States had the resources to help rebuild Europe and to get it on its feet again. At a commencement speech at Harvard University in June of 1947, Secretary of State Marshall outlined our plan. He said our program was not directed against any nation, but against hunger and poverty, and that any nation that sought our help would receive it. This program was submitted to the Congress and approved by the Congress, and was officially called the European Recovery Program, but it was more popularly known, and I should say properly known, as the Marshall Plan. As a result of the Marshall Plan, we were able to extend billions of dollars of aid to Western Europe, rebuild it, get it on its feet again, and rejoin the family of nations. And as a result of his efforts, George Marshall was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Well, I'm very proud that we called it the Marshall Plan. We had to call it the Marshall Plan. That Republican 80th Congress wasn't going to approve of anything called the Truman Plan. Now, of course, in December of 1941, we entered the Second World War, and we were now spending more money than we ever had in our nation's history, why more so than even under the New Deal. And back at the Congress, we were receiving reports about waste and spending at defense plants and military bases. Well, I proposed we set up a watchdog committee to oversee this spending. I was elected the chairman of this committee, and it was popularly known as the Truman Committee. As a result of our committee's investigations, we were able to save the taxpayers billions and billions of dollars. Why, when they actually took a poll of reporters in Washington, D.C. and asked who had done the most to contribute to the war effort in our nation's capital, our committee came in second, right behind Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. Well, the work of the Truman Committee was getting a lot of national attention, and 1944 was an election year. Of course, we in the Democratic Party would renominate Franklin Roosevelt to run for a fourth term of office. But there were many Democrats, especially among the Southern Democrats, who are very reluctant about renominating Vice President Henry Wallace. And they were looking for a candidate who would be acceptable not just to Southern Democrats, but to Northern Democrats and labor leaders. Well, there was talk about nominating me for Vice President. But I didn't want to hear anything of it. I wasn't interested in the job at all. I enjoyed serving in the Senate, where I was actually contributing something to our nation. I didn't want to end my political career in obscurity as vice president. I mean, after all, who could remember the last several men who had been vice president? I didn't want to have that happen to me. I remember what my good friend and predecessor as vice president, John Nance Garner, said about the office. He said it wasn't worth a warm pitcher of spit. And those weren't his exact words. And then I recall a story told by Thomas Marshall, Woodrow Wilson's vice president. He told a story about a mother who had two sons. One went to sea, the other became vice president. Neither was ever heard from again. Well, we held the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in July of 1944, and of course I attended as a delegate from Missouri. And when I arrived there, people were asking me about running for vice president. I said, no, I'm not interested in the job at all. Well, I was called into the hotel suite of Bob Hannigan. He was the Democratic National Chairman. He was also a friend and supporter of mine from Missouri. And when I entered his hotel suite, he was having a telephone conversation which went something like this. I can't help it, Mr. President. He must be the most stubborn Missouri mule I ever met. Well, he holds up the telephone receiver, and I hear that familiar voice from the White House saying, if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, he can have that on his conscience. Bob, why don't you tell me he wanted me for the job? Well, President Roosevelt and I were nominated at that convention, and of course, we were elected in November of 1944. In January 1945, Franklin Roosevelt took his fourth oath of office as president, and I was sworn in as vice president. But as many of you know, that was not to last very long. 82 days later, on a day that I will never forget, it was a Thursday, April 12, 1945, I had just finished presiding over a session of the United States Senate. And I'd gone to the office of my good friend, House Speaker Sam Rayburn, for some drinks. While I was there, I'd received word from Steve Early President Roosevelt's press secretary to come over to the White House and to come over immediately, which I did. I entered through the north entrance, and I was immediately ushered into Mrs. Roosevelt's study. She stepped forward, she placed her hand gently on my shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Well, for a moment, I couldn't say anything. And then I asked her, "Is there anything that we can do for you?" And I'll never forget her gentle and understanding reply, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now." Well, I don't know if any of you have ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what had happened, I felt as if the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. That evening, I was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. I held my first cabinet meeting, and I made my first decision as President that the San Francisco Conference, scheduled in 2 weeks' time to organize the United Nations organization, would go on as scheduled. I believe it was very important that the United States take a leading role in the formation of the United Nations. I believe we made a terrible mistake after the First World War by not listening to the advice of President Wilson and joining the League of Nations, because if we had joined it and had taken an active role, we might have been able to prevent a second world war. And I was to spend the next 7.5 years as president trying to prevent a third world war. Well, when the cabinet meeting adjourned, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, stayed to talk to me privately for a few minutes. And what he revealed to me in those few minutes was the greatest secret of the Second World War, that we were building a weapon of enormous destruction, an atomic bomb, and it was going to be my duty and responsibility as president to decide what we were to do with this terrible weapon. Within 3 weeks of succeeding to the presidency, Nazi Germany surrendered. And it appeared by all accounts that the war against Japan would continue on for much longer, probably into 1946. And according to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they told me that in order to defeat Japan, it would require a direct Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. They told me that such an invasion would easily result in at least 500,000 American casualties and probably millions of Japanese casualties, both military and civilian. It was my duty and responsibility as president to bring that war to a swift conclusion as quickly as possible. In July of 1945, we set sail for Potsdam in Germany, where I met with Prime Minister Churchill, Premier Stalin, and later Prime Minister Attlee of Great Britain. While I was there, I had received word that the atomic bomb had been successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. We immediately issued a public ultimatum to Japan, calling upon their complete and unconditional surrender. And if they did not meet our terms for surrender, they could expect complete and absolute destruction from the skies. We leafleted Japanese cities urging them to surrender. When we received no reply from the Japanese government, I ordered the atomic bomb dropped on 2 military targets, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was after the second bomb was dropped that the Japanese agreed to our terms to surrender. It was a decision I never regretted, nor did I ever lose any sleep over it. Now, when I succeeded to the presidency in April of 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been president for more than 12 years, longer than any man in history. And for many people who grew up during that time, he was the only president they ever knew. And for many other people, it took them a much longer time to get used to the fact that, well, I was now president. I remember I had been president only 2 days, and I had a meeting with Jesse Jones. He had been the Secretary of Commerce, and we were discussing a presidential appointment. And he asked me, "Did the president make that appointment before he died?" I said, "No, he made it right now." And during my first week as president, I had a meeting with the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Mr. Molotov. Already I could see we were beginning to have problems with the Russians. 2 months earlier at Yalta, in Russia, President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Premier Stalin had signed a series of agreements, the Yalta Agreements, concerning post-war rule in Europe and accords concerning the liberated nations of Europe. Well, one of those accords included free elections in the liberated nations of Europe. Well, already the Soviet Union was imposing its own communist regime upon Poland, and I told Molotov that this was a direct violation of the Yalta Agreements. He told me he had never been spoken to in such a manner. Well, I told him, honor your agreements and I won't talk to you that way. And that's only the beginning of the problems that we had with the Russians that led to this Cold War. Now, being president of the United States is like riding a tiger. A man has to constantly keep on riding or be swallowed. Those fantastically crowded months of 1945 taught me that a president is either on top of events, or if he hesitates, events will soon be on top of him. And I felt I could never let up for a moment. Now, the president must make his own decisions. He cannot pass the buck up or down. Information is what he needs. And when he has the right information, he and only he is in a position to make those decisions. The decisions that a president has to make often affect the lives of millions of people around the world, but that does not mean they should take any longer to make. Now, there are some men who fret and delay under criticism, but I have a saying that applies here, and not too many people have taken it up. If you can't stand the heat, then get out of the kitchen. Well, 1948 was an election year, and I was determined to run for a full term on my own. Unfortunately, in the mid-year elections of November 1946, or I should say the midterm elections of November 1946, the Republican Party had won control of both houses of Congress and a majority of governorships for the first time in 16 years. And it was the observation and opinion of many of the political experts that the Republicans would complete that by winning the White House in the elections of 1948. Well, I know quite a lot about experts, because I can tell you what an expert is. It's a fellow who doesn't want to know anymore because he won't be an expert anymore. But I knew that the people of this country weren't ready to turn back the clock, not if they were told the facts. And I figured the best way to do it was the way I'd always done it before. That was by going out in the back of a train and telling the people exactly what was going on, and that's exactly what I did. I must have spoken to about 15 or 20 million people. I convinced them, and they voted for me. And even if I had lost the election, the feeling I got in that campaign is that the people of this country want to do the right thing. And what you got to do is tell them what the right thing is. Well, as I told you earlier, we held the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia in July of 1948. And a lot of those delegates didn't think I had a chance at all. Oh yes, I heard it from them. I'm just mild about Harry. To err is Truman. But when I got up to accept the nomination, I set the tone for the campaign, and it went something like this. Senator Barkley and I will win this election and make these Republicans like it. Don't you forget that. Now, my friends, on the 26th of July, which we in Missouri call Turn-Up Day, I am going to call that Republican Congress back into session to pass the legislation which they say they are for in their platform, such as civil rights legislation, which they say they are for, a national housing program, which they say they are for, a national health insurance program, which they say they are for, a rise in the minimum wage, which I doubt very much they are for. Now, my friends, they're going to have 15 days to pass this legislation, and they're still going to have plenty of time to go out and campaign for re-election. But, my friends, they're going to dodge the bullet. They're going to pass the buck. They're going to pull out every single red herring that they can. And Senator Barkley and I aren't going to let them get away with it. And if you stay home like you did in 1946, then you deserve everything you've gotten. That you've gotten from the last 2 years, from that do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republican 80th Congress. And if that's a lot of hooey and that rhymes with somebody else's name, that's not my fault. Well, that was the tone of the campaign. I went after that do-nothing, good-for-nothing Republican 80th Congress, and I began to hear it from the crowds. Pour it on, Harry, pour it on. Well, we were having an enthusiastic rally in Seattle, Washington, and a man with a great big voice cried out from the galleries, "Give 'em hell, Harry!" Well, I told him at the time, and I've been repeating it ever since, I've never deliberately given anybody hell. I tell the truth on the opposition, and they think it's hell. Now, my friends, we've been hearing a lot in this campaign about the polls. Let me tell you something about the polls. The polls are like sleeping pills. They're designed to lull the voters into sleeping on Election Day. Some of the voters have been taking them, but most of the voters aren't being fooled. They know that sleeping polls can be dangerous and an overdose can be fatal. Well, when the campaign concluded, I returned to Independence where I voted on Election Day. And that evening I had a sandwich and a glass of buttermilk and went to bed about 6:30. And then long around about midnight, I happened to wake up for some reason or other, and the radio was tuned to the National Broadcasting Company. And their commentator, Mr. Keltenborn, like the rest of the experts, he didn't think I had a chance at all, was reporting the vote as it came in, and it sounded something like this. While the president is 1,000,000 votes ahead in the popular vote, we have yet to hear from the country vote. And we are very assured that when the country vote gets in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority. Well, I went back to bed and went to sleep. And then long about 4 a.m. I woke up again, and according to Mr. Keltenborn, my lead in the popular count had now grown to 2,000,000 votes. But he was convinced I couldn't win it all. He said the election would be decided by the House of Representatives. Well, I listened to the breakdown of the vote, and I called in the Secret Service man, and I told him, I think we better head back to Kansas City. It looks as if I'm elected. Then long about 10 a.m., I'd received a telegram which said I should be congratulated on the fact that I'd won the election. Apparently, it was too bad, but it happened. Oh, by the way, here's one for the books. My most difficult decision as president came 2 years later. That was Korea. I remember it was a weekend in late June of 1950. I was back in Independence with Margaret and Bess getting away from the big white jail in Washington when I received a telephone call from the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson. He had told me that the armed forces of Communist North Korea had crossed the 38th parallel and were quickly advancing upon the South Korean capital city of Seoul. My first reaction was, Dean, we got to stop these sons of bitches. He had told me he'd called for a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. And fortunately, the Soviet Union was boycotting it, so they couldn't veto any resolution that we would pass. And we did pass a resolution. It condemned North Korea as an aggressor nation and called upon all member nations of the United Nations to come to the aid of South Korea. As I was heading back to Washington to meet with the National Security Council to decide what our course of action would be, and it would be military intervention, I thought over the fact we had seen the same damn thing happen in the 1930s. Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese warlords had done exactly the same thing, and the League of Nations had let them get away with it. And I wasn't about to let this attack on South Korea go through, because if it did, it would lead to a third world war. And I wasn't about to let that happen. Not while I was president. This was a police action, a limited war, whatever you wish to call it, in order to stop aggression and to prevent a larger war. And that was our policy in Korea. Even after China intervened in late 1950, our policy was to confine the fighting to the Korean Peninsula. We didn't want to spread it into China or the Soviet Union and start a larger war. That's what we were trying to prevent. Well, as you know, the President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. And as Commander-in-Chief, he makes military policy which the generals and the admirals are to carry out. Unfortunately, we happen to have a Supreme Commander over in the Far East, and a 5-star general of the Army at that, who thought it was his duty to make policy for this country. So I fired General MacArthur because he wouldn't respect the authority of his Commander-in-Chief. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch. Oh, he was. But of course, that's not against the law for most generals. If it was, half to three-quarters then would probably be in jail. The only thing I learned how the whole MacArthur deal is, deep in your gut, there's something you got to do. The sooner you get it over with, the better off everybody is. And I'll tell you about the problems I had with MacArthur. If he had had his way, he would have had us in a third world war and probably blown up half to two-thirds of the world. Oh, I think you all know and recognize who this is. That's God. And people who think they are God are bound to get in trouble sooner or later. As I said earlier, there is nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. Men don't change. The only thing that changes are the names that we give people and places. As I said, there's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know. And finally, I'd like to read a letter that I wrote to my daughter, Margaret. In it, I said, "Your dad will never be reckoned among the great, but you can be sure he did his level best and gave all he had to his country." There's an epitaph on Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona, which reads, "Here lies Jack Williams, he done his damnedest." Well, that's all I could do. I did my damnedest, and that's all there is to it. Now, if you have any questions for me about my life or my times or my presidency, please feel free to ask. And don't worry about any questions you may want to ask. I've probably had more smoke blown in my face than any man alive. Yes, sir. Okay, the question was, what did I do during the Depression? Well, actually, by the time the Depression hit, I was already a public official. I was already in my 40s, and of course I was 50 years old when I was elected to the Senate. But during that time, or before I was elected to the Senate, I was, of course, a county judge. And at one point I was actually what was called presiding judge of Jackson County, which in some places would be like a county executive. And we built a new courthouse in Independence. We built new roads throughout the county. And of course in 1934 I was elected to the United States Senate. Well, I graduated high school, and that was it. I never went to college, although I did do a lot of reading, because I read a lot of history, although I will say this, I did take a few night courses in law school, but never finished. Did the Pendergast machine ever lean on me while I was either a county judge or a senator? No, I had a good relationship with Tom, and we understood each other, and I never had any problems with him, although I know I was criticized later as being the senator from Pendergast and being Pendergast's boy, but I was never involved with any of the corruption that unfortunately got him in trouble. Well, I did meet with Stalin and Churchill after the war at Potsdam.
What was your impression of Stalin?
What was my impression of Stalin? Well, at first I thought I could get along with old Uncle Joe. He reminded me in some ways of Tom Pendergast. But I learned quite quickly that he was a tough fellow to deal with. And of course, his actions in Europe only helped create this Cold War that we're now going through. Did I have any hints at Potsdam that Stalin knew about the atomic bomb? Well, of course, when it was successfully tested, I told Churchill, and he, of course, was elated. When I told Stalin, he had no reaction. I thought at the time maybe he didn't understand what I was telling him. Of course, later on we found out that he had spies in our atomic program who actually sent him the information. Was I surprised when Prime Minister Churchill was voted out of office during the Potsdam Conference? Oh, yes, I was. After all, if there was any man who was the true hero of World War II, it was Winston Churchill. He had stood up to Hitler when nobody else did. And without that resistance, why, we would not have been able to enter and win that war. Yes, I was very surprised, but of course, he came back about 6 years later as Prime Minister. Well, at the Potsdam Conference, Stalin was supposed to be the chairman of that conference. Instead, he nominated me to be the chairman of that conference.
Can you talk about what an honor it was?
Well, of course, it was a great honor to be the chairman of the conference. After all, I'd only been president, my goodness, just a few months, and I was totally unprepared for being president. I mean, after all, I know Winston Churchill said that when I became president, he loathed me because I had replaced his dear friend and ally. But he later said at the end of my presidency that I had done more to save Western civilization than any man alive. Did I have any strong views about Dwight Eisenhower, Ike? Well, first of all, I want to say that Ike served under me as Army Chief of Staff. And when we formed NATO in 1949, I asked him in 1950 to become the first Supreme Commander of NATO, and he served me very well, as I said, as the Army Chief of Staff and as Supreme Commander of NATO. Now, of course, we had some differences starting in 1952. He sought the Republican nomination for president, and I was happy to see that he defeated Bob Taft for that. But unfortunately, in that campaign, he criticized my administration, which I expected from the opposition party. But there was one thing he did that I cannot forgive him for. During that campaign, you know, Joe McCarthy, senator from Wisconsin, was running around calling my administration, saying it was full of communists. And he said that George Marshall, can you believe it? George Marshall was a traitor to this nation. Well, Ike was going to give a speech in McCarthy's home state of Wisconsin, a campaign speech, where he was to defend General Marshall. Well, McCarthy got on his campaign train, and as a result, that was deleted from Ike's campaign speech. Well, when that became public, I was outraged. If it wasn't for General Marshall, Ike wouldn't even have a career in the Army. I'm going to tell you something. Marshall told me that at the end of the war, Ike had told him he was going to divorce Mamie and marry that Jeep driver over there in England. And Marshall said if he even thought of it, he'd make sure he wouldn't even have a career in the Army. Well, yes, MacArthur was shocked when I fired him. Yes, he was, and there was a lot of outrage by the American people. How could I fire this great man who wanted victory? But later on, when everything quieted down, people realized that I'd made the right decision. Even General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that if we'd listened to MacArthur, we'd find ourselves in the wrong war, in the wrong place, in the wrong time.
Your mother-in-law.
How did I get along with my mother-in-law? I have never spoken about it publicly, but I will tell you, she always thought that Bess married below her. And of course, as you know, I lived in my mother-in-law's home, so I had to watch what I said. And I tolerated my mother-in-law. Oh, I know she said that many other men would make a fine president, like that fine gentleman, Mr. Dewey. And of course, she couldn't understand why a mere captain like me could fire a general like MacArthur. Well, Bess stood up for me and told my mother-in-law, "Mother, Harry is the commander-in-chief." What would I say about the present Republican Party? Or the same thing I probably said about it in the past. After all, the Republicans have General MacArthur, they have General Eisenhower, and General Motors, and all we have is general welfare. Who do I consider within the Roosevelt administration responsible for the GI Bill of Rights? Well, of course, we passed it in the Senate, and I strongly supported it. And of course, the GI Bill of Rights gave returning veterans opportunities that other veterans did not have after other wars, not just some financial support among their release from military service, but also loans for houses, opportunity for a college education, which of course I never had, and as a result was able to stimulate the economy after the war. You know, usually it was after a war, usually there's always a recession or depression. Yes, we did have some economic difficulties after the war of adjusting to a peaceful post-war economy, but eventually, within a few years, our economy was prospering again. What did I do when I returned to Missouri after retiring from the presidency? Well, I was asked that by a reporter from NBC, a man named Ray Scher, and he asked me, what did I do when I got home? You know what I told him? I took the grips up to the attic. But, of course, I have an office in Kansas City where I answer a lot of correspondence. I wrote my memoirs, which I was well paid for. And then in 1957, we opened up the Truman Library just a few blocks from our home in Independence. Did I receive any pension after my presidency? Actually, when I retired as president in 1953, there were no pensions for former presidents. All I had was a small government or army pension as a result of my military service. But several years later, the Congress actually passed a law which gave pensions to all former presidents. Oh, I could have taken lots of well-paying jobs after I left the presidency. I was offered to be sitting on the boards of lots of corporations, but they weren't hiring Harry Truman. They were trying to buy the presidency. And it's a sad day when the presidency can be bought. Well, at the time, I was getting something like $10,000 as a pension, and I think the pension was raised to much more than that later on. What will it take to find another fellow like me? Well, people have asked me if they think I was a good president. I don't know, but I had a good time trying to be one. Well, before we continue, there is one person I would like to introduce. I haven't seen him for many years. He used to work on my staff. His name is Cecil Flenner, and he was an assistant naval aide to me. Cecil, would you like to come up? I know it's been a long time since we've seen each other. Yes, I asked Cecil to tell the audience what he did in my administration.
Well, it was a very busy time, I must say, when this president was a very hard worker. We would have to get there, contrary to the previous administration, when they come to work at 10 o'clock and go home early. When he got at his desk at 7 o'clock and nobody was there, that was the last time that ever happened. So we were there from 7 o'clock until about 8 o'clock at night, or until he decided to go to the office. And he was a hard worker, and everybody was expected to do the same thing. Some of the things that we did, everything that came to the president from Congress passed through our hands for analysis. Anything from the public regarding the Navy or the Coast Guard came through our hands. And then I sometimes had other little duties, like finding out why the president only had 4 stars and the generals had 5. That's why we wound up with the circle with a star for every state, and things like that. I think most people don't realize your great sense of humor. And I remember on the ship going over that you like to run around with a sailor hat, a white hat on your head. And I didn't realize that you until I saw you in your stateroom, and I went in there to chase that sailor out of there. I thought, and you looked up and you got a big laugh out of that. And everybody else, as they saw you run around, enjoyed that very much. The other thing I remember was Fred Canfield, who had been your bailiff, I guess you call him, when you were a judge. And these people have a habit of pushing people around a little bit. And Stalin complained about him pushing his people around. So you said you'd take care of it. And then the first chance you had when you were out on deck, and Stalin was out there, and so was Fred Canfield. So you put the two of them together, and you introduced Canfield to Stalin as Marshal Canfield, which impressed the hell out of Stalin. So from that point on, he treated Canfield with the highest respect. He thought he was a high-level man when Canfield was one of your bailiffs, and everybody got a big kick out of that. So those are two examples of his great sense of. There were others that I can't think of right offhand, but we really enjoyed traveling with the president.
Well, thank you, Cecil.
But there was always something to do, and there were 10 major events that happened during that last 6 months I was there, and it was a hard life, but it was extremely interesting. And this is one of the best guys I ever worked for.
Well,
Mr.
thank
President,
you,
thank you. And it's good to see you again,
good
sir.
to see you.
I hope I see you again before another 10 years.
I hope so. Well, no, I remember those incidences very clearly. And I want to thank Cecil for reminding us of that. She wanted to know how long I've been doing these presentations or performances or portrayals. Actually, I started a little over 25 years ago when I decided to go into education, and I was studying to become a history teacher. at the University of Maryland, and I began to do this starting in when I was doing teacher observations, student teaching, teaching religious schools, substituting, and even teaching full-time for a few years here in California. And I've actually been going out doing this professionally for about 18 years. Who else do I portray? I also portray George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Edison, Franklin Roosevelt, believe it or not, Golda Meir, which is one of my better ones, and longer ones. No, I lived in Israel for a number of years, so I feel very qualified to do that. I'm also developing Theodore Roosevelt, John Adams, and I also do Moses the lawgiver. So you can get either a historical version, yes. Yes.
Do Moses as Charlton Heston or as Moses?
Do I do Moses as Charlton Heston or as Moses? Well, it's a question. Do you want the religious version or do you want the historical version? Because a lot of my portrayals, depending on whom I'm doing, for example, someone like Washington or Edison, I do, and even Theodore Roosevelt, I have two versions that I do, one for adults and, of course, one for children. And my children's version usually is much more interactive. I involve the kids in the storytelling.
You do Golda Meir in drag?
Do I do her? I do. To me, doing Golda Meir is no different than doing Washington or Adams or Jefferson. I change wigs and stockings.
What about doing a two-part Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton in the same context?
Have I thought of doing do a two-part show of one doing Hamilton and the other doing Jefferson? No. Actually, what I would like to do, since I'm developing John Adams, I do know another Thomas Jefferson impersonator. I'd like us to get together and have a debate between the two of them, or discussion. Actually, I've done one as Theodore Roosevelt with two other performers, friends of mine, one who does Abraham Lincoln, the other does James Garfield, which we've done for Forest Lawn a few years ago. And it turned out instead of besides just answering questions from the audience, we had a dialogue among ourselves because there was a lot of connections because all their lives overlapped one another. So there was some very interesting connections between all three men. That's a good question. I've always get that question. What's my secret of memorizing all that information? The challenge is not learning the information. That's the easy part. The challenge is how to make it interesting for the audience, whether it's adults or children. That's the challenge. And I find one way that works is telling anecdotes and stories that help illustrate something about that person that I'm portraying.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.